Paul, thank you very much again for joining this. Qlik Support is going to do sessions like this more frequently and around once or twice a month in multiple languages. And sessions will be all based on support cases that we frequently get. We occasionally review these cases and see what's very common and make the topic, and we start talking about that specific topic and situations that we came across in support cases and how we solved them and what were the causes, and we try to share this information. Okay, so the topic today, how to minimize the upgrade related issue quickly to Qlik Sense. The most common issues that we came across in past support cases were related to a number of recurring situations. And like I said earlier, we compiled all this and we made this initial list, which we're going to talk a bit more detail in each item in this list. And these cases were around the last 2 years that we kept observing and noticing that are continuously coming up. One of the main causes is the fact that when Qlik Sense environment and the server is being upgraded, some cases we notice that the minimum requirements are not met during the upgrade, which means in the past it was, and during the upgrade it's quite a long time have passed and people just did not look at the requirements again to make sure that the environment is valid and ready for the upgrade. The another common problem is the old hardware specification needs to be evaluated before each upgrade. Servers with old hardware, people assume that it's still going to work with the newer version of the product. And the reality is that it's not, and things will be very slow. And we will tap into this area in a bit more detail. Same applies to old network devices. Before the upgrade, network devices are everything between the client machine, the user browser, and the server itself. And whether it's going via the ISP or from the ISP going into virtual private network, there are so many devices there, like reverse proxies and load balancers that need to be evaluated before the upgrade because technology changes and these devices have certain settings in them that need to be looked at. The other point is the fact that upgrade documentation that is available in the support portal, knowledge base articles, the help page, community, they seem to be followed, but not to the amount of detail that's needed. And of course, anything not followed in detail may lead to things to break. One common area with Qlik Sense is the incremental upgrade. If a system is getting upgraded from very old version to the most recent version. And we can go through this a bit more as well a bit later on. Another common problem is general slowness. People upgrade, they come and open support cases and say, why is the system running very slowly? So we will look into this area as well and a few points there that needs attention. Next, this list is just a brief points there. Behavior difference, again, people notice that sort order is changed or certain objects in a dashboard is behaving differently. The look and feel also, sometimes colors are different, the display looks different. Connections failing, and there is a very good reason behind this. We will go through as well. Number of tasks. situations where the tasks are the same, nothing changed, but tasks starting to fail. Same with total number of users. There haven't been new users added, but suddenly after the upgrade, people are experiencing resource problems. And a few last 4 points there are things like environment diagram. We will tap into that as well and see why it's important. Some environments don't have test, development, or UAT environments before production, so we can discuss that as well. No backups, which is a bit surprising, but we do come across environments that upgraded and things went wrong and there are no backups. And of course, there are quite a lot of other less common issues, but we can have a session about those another time. Now, what can be done to address those quick points that I discussed earlier? First thing first, it's to set up environments, to set up a development and testing environment with minimal security and flexibility to have bypass options in these layers of security or layers of devices within the network. It's always good to have this development environment to initially test things and avoid surprises. And of course, if things break, people can go there and bypass certain layers and test. And if it's confirmed, the layer gets enabled and the next level of testing can progress. All this can save time with opening cases, investigating the environment. Having this flexibility is quite good. We have large customers who have this, and it showed quite a lot of value and time saving to narrow down issue related to communication or security or etc. UAT environment, it's very, very recommended to have, and it's good to have the UAT high security in a very similar setup to production, so that if the development environment works, then everything can be tested with higher security, more security hardening that matches production. So by the time upgrade reaches production, there are no surprises and everything should work based on UAT testing. This is why we mentioned UAT in production should exactly be the same in terms of hardware, resources, security, deployment, and communication point, and network devices. Some environments have older network devices, some have newer, some do not match. So it's good to at least document all this and be ready to look into each key point during the upgrade. Once these development, UAT, and production environments are set up, we very, very much recommend that these environments are detailed in the support portal. Now, many of you who open support cases can see that there is an option there that says environments. So if you enter the license number, Qlik Sense version, patch number, and define the environment, all that can come to the Qlik support pre-defined, and we don't have to ask you again to provide us all this information. If these are maintained up to date all the time after each upgrade, life gets much easier and quicker. It's very, very important. And every time we make phone calls, at the moment, we are reminding users to go and set up these environment details that match the real environment. And these environment details and diagrams that we keep asking will be kept for reference in the future. So if another case comes along after a few months, we can refer to this diagram. We have a repository of users, user details, user environments, and the diagrams we can attach. And then any engineer can go there and review the environment and see what devices there are and what could be causing certain issues mentioned in support cases. So at the end of the day, all we're trying to do is be a bit more proactive and show and work with you that we are familiar with your environment, and we can push things to the next level and focus more on the issue than understanding the environment each time. This proactiveness will become more and more focused with support. Now, environment diagrams, of course, fundamentally they are the same, but it's good to mention there if it's Amazon Web Services, Azure, Google Cloud, or physical servers. So it's good to have that. It's good to also mention the number of nodes, the repository in Qlik Sense, whether it's by default, whether it's standalone, some information about hardware. In this diagram also, you can add another page of network diagram, all the communication layer and network devices. In terms of authentication, you could also display there whether you're using AD or IDP. Gives us better understanding. Firewall, security layers. If you have proxy servers, reverse proxy servers like IIS, we have quite a few environments there, people using IIS. And it's good to see where that sits in the communication, and then we can tap into its configuration and so on. Shared folders, as you all know, Qlik Sense has shared persistence, shared folders, and we would like to know where these folders exist. Are they on one of the nodes? Are they on a network shared folder? Where does it sit? What kind of devices are between the shared folder and the nodes, for example? Same with load balancers, third-party network load balancers. It's good to specify where the load balancer is and what type of load balancer it is, because we dealt with quite a few, and each load balancer seems to have specific way to set up the settings area, to set it up and specify certain settings there, especially things like idle timeout, or the way these devices deal with technologies like WebSockets that we can discuss a bit later. All these are changing. These technologies are getting incorporated into Qlik Sense, and these network devices, all the communication points should comply with the way they handle these communication protocols. This is a typical diagram, very basic, shows exactly what we need, shows the communication points, shows where the databases are for data connections, shows the file storage, shows the repository database, shows where the user sits and what kind of security and internal network exists. And something like this could be really good, and then we can develop this and put more details on it as needed. Now, during the upgrade, it's good to have a plan. It's always good to have certain information ready and set up before the upgrade takes place. It's good to have a checklist. It's good to draw up a backup plan and upgrade plan. If things break, you can always revert back. If you have daily backups already in place, it's good to check if they are successful, if the last backup was done, where it is it working, is it not corrupt, and so on. So rollback can be easy if something fails, even in the development environment, just to save you time. Again, this is something quite basic, but we do come across environments where the upgrade is done and there is no backup. The failover readiness also is important in environments. When Qlik Sense is upgraded, it's also good to see how the failover setup was done and upgrade those nodes as well, even though they are failover nodes. Windows updates, again, a very important point there. Windows updates tend to break Qlik Sense very frequently. And depending on when the Windows update has been done and where it has been done, it's good to do these all on development, UAT first, and then production. Make sure the existing Qlik Sense server is up to date with Windows updates, and then attempt the upgrade. It's not good to do the upgrade and apply Windows updates at the same time, just to avoid confusion, which one went first and what caused it to break. So it's good to bring everything up to date, security, Windows up to date, test, make sure everything is working, and then attempt the upgrade in test and UAT. Again, as it says there, always, focus on test and dev before production, and test all the applications, all the dashboards. Have a good test, have a look through them, and make sure there are no issues in display or slowness. The minimum system requirements, of course, it's on the help page and it's always up to date. Antivirus and software scanning software on the server, it's good to either configure them properly, add exclusion rules in there so nothing interferes with the upgrade, or disable during the upgrade if you can. Just again, to make sure that if an issue happens, we know where to look. The service account credentials. Many environments, many users attempt to upgrade, and halfway through they discover that they don't know the service account details or the repository database username and password. And of course, they either have to roll back or keep it like that and spend some time going and finding where these details are. The repository database location, some people get a bit confused about where it is because they may have had the original database on the central node repository setup, and then they moved it on a dedicated node. And then a third person came along who's doing the upgrade and doesn't know where it is. It's good to specify this and make sure exactly which database you're dealing with. Some environments, the user deletes the old database and keeps the only one that is used. But some environments, we notice the old one also sits there. And then we have to go and check the connection string and see where the communication is and so on. Shared folder permissions, group policies, it's good to be familiar. It's good to know what's being pushed to the server in terms of security and group policies, because we do get cases where the installer breaks and the installer checks the user who's doing the installation. Most of the time, it's the service user logged in. However, due to some security policy and group policy, the administrator appears to Qlik Sense as non-admin user, and we came across this a lot. And people had to go back and check and disable some policies there, because Qlik Sense sees the administrator sometimes impacted by this group policy, and the installation stops. It detects that it is not an administrator. The number of nodes also, if it's a multi-node environment and the repository is expecting connections from all the nodes, there are settings that need to be evaluated and increased, especially if during the upgrades users add more nodes. Then the max connections that the Qlik Sense repository expects need to be increased so that the communication doesn't break and the connections continue to work. The recommended number there is 110 for each node. So if you have 3 nodes, it's 330. But we have environments where we recommend this to be increased much higher than that, 700, 800. So this is the minimum needed. These are all checkpoints it's good to refer to during upgrades. It's a reminder. Upgrade checklist continues. Customization. If you have customizations, for example, config files, where, as you all know, Qlik Sense services, each service has a config file that can be modified, settings changed, settings extended. If you modified these files, it's good to have a list of them and back them up. Or if you have a full backup, then it's good to know that there are customized config files, because during the upgrade, these config files will get overwritten and they will all go back to default settings. So then you will need to copy the original config file back. And more than copying, we recommend to actually compare, because newer config files have newer parameters in them. If you overwrite the old config file, if you overwrite the new config file with the backup, then you may lose some of these settings that have been introduced in newer version of Qlik Sense. So it's good to have to use some file comparison tool, or even if you note what exact setting parameter has been changed, and copy and paste that back into the new version of the config file. That way you're guaranteed that everything is clean and up to date. Custom extensions, as you know, we have bundled extensions, we have custom extensions, and people are becoming more used to now. They know which bundled extensions there are, which are supported. But when it comes to custom extensions, we come across quite a lot of cases and complaints about custom extensions stop working after the upgrade. These extensions are third party, and you will need to talk to the developer where you downloaded these. These developers sometimes check and test against latest version of Qlik Sense, which was available when this extension came out. And later on, the extension stayed old, may not work with newer version of Qlik Sense. So it's good to confirm with them before the upgrade. Certificates, there are, of course, SSL certificates and service certificates internally between the services. So it's good to back these up via MMC and export them before any upgrade. More common points there: hardware speed before and after the upgrade. Again, things may slow down, so it's good to see if that hardware speed for the older version of Qlik Sense needs to be evaluated. Network communication speed, again, newer versions of Qlik Sense have larger code base. There is visualizations are much updated, and the code base, the client-side code base that downloads when you open the hub onto the client machine in the browser keeps getting bigger. And of course, these things could lead to some slowness. So it's always good to check the network speed. Size of deployment, we discussed that. Number of reload tasks, scheduler node. It's good to also consider this, how many reload tasks you have, and how many CPU cores are there. Because as you know, number of concurrent reload tasks is usually based on the number of cores minus 1. So if you have 16 core, you could run 14 tasks. Start from less and then 14, 15 maximum. Most systems, 14 is good as a number. And as you do upgrades, it's good to always keep this point in mind and test the concurrent reloads. The time of reload tasks is also important. Again, sometimes concurrent overlap reload tasks can start to break. The number of apps on each node that are served from each node, even though they are served from the shared folder, it's good to see how these apps are served, which ones are the consumer nodes, and how the apps are served when you upgrade, because the software size is changing. The local and dedicated repository database is quite important. Again, it's mentioned here, and we will go through these settings a bit later on in a different slide. The RAM we discussed, number of users during business hours, workloads, we discussed that. Now, geographic location of server and geographic location of users. Again, two very important points there to check, because you may need to reconsider and see where your Qlik Sense server is running from, and how these users are accessing Qlik Sense server from where in the world. Because certain networks overseas, we come across support cases where these networks show slowness if people access through these networks. It's a bit complicated, but it seems to be dependent on the location and the network devices there of the carrier or the ISP who the user is using. In large deployments, we noticed that having multiple geographic location Qlik Sense servers help to serve each users in each location. The centralized logging service, this is something you all may have come across. It's not very new, but it's in newer versions of Qlik Sense. And it basically puts all the logs in the repository database in the Postgre repository. Of course, it adds a layer of slowness in environments. Some environments disable this, and then they enable it in development on UAT, and if all appears to be okay, they enable it in production. But it does add overheads to performance, and the number of the database size will keep getting bigger and bigger. There are also other databases, which I will show you in a minute, to keep that in mind. Again, the layer of communication with the database is something, is the key point here to remember, that newer version of Qlik Sense have more database interaction and more databases. And of course, logging debug settings. This keeps coming up in support cases. Debug is turned on via QMC on production, and suddenly people discover, oh, it's on and it's slow. It's writing logs that are not necessary. So it's good to keep that in mind and turn them off in production and keep them on UAT or development. So yeah, do not attempt to upgrade production until upgrade and test are carried out on development server and approved, and then tested on UAT. It's to make sure, again, to avoid downtime of production and security issues detected, resource issues detected, no surprises, apps are running successfully, performance isn't affected, reload tasks are successful, and so on. Because if you have a reference to UAT or development and you know that it works, it's very, very easy to compare that with production later on and narrow down the issue. Some other issues that people come across during the upgrade is that halfway through the upgrade fails due to security. 90% of this is security and group policies when the upgrade fails. 10% is related to Windows environment and configuration related. Could be .NET version not up to date, or could be some conflicting exe running on the server, conflicting with the installer process. But most of the time, it's security when the upgrade fails. Apps opening very slowly. This is very, very common. We're putting newer version of software on an older service. Things will slow down. The newer versions of Qlik Sense, expressions, evaluation, and calculation changes, and they continuously get updated in versions of Qlik Sense. Some existing product updates impact on old app workarounds. So if somebody had a workaround there to get something working, and that workaround will break, however, undoing the workaround will make it work. So it's a good point to keep in mind. Now, this last point, more repository databases. This is very, very important. And I took a screenshot from the repository to show you what's in the recent versions. So, of course, most of us know pgadmin and how we access the repository. You will see there that originally it used to be the QSR Qlik Sense repository database. And now there is Qlogs, QSMQ, Sense Services, and Postgre. Postgre is the master database that controls these databases. So that's settings and that should be untouched. However, apart from Qlik Sense, Qlogs is where the logs are stored. QSMQ, it's called messaging service, Qlik Sense messaging service between the services. It's internal messaging and it's stored there. And in later versions of Qlik Sense, we will have more interaction with that and maybe more user interfaces to see what's happening in there. Same thing with Sense services. At the moment, it lists the Qlik Sense services. And I believe it also taps into the service dispatcher on microservices. And a lot of these settings will be stored in this database rather than config files. So that's the reason behind it. The point here is also when the hub opens and users are working with Qlik Sense, behind the scenes, the code base is interacting with these databases. So before it was only talking to QSR. Now it's talking to Qlogs, QSMQ, and Sense services. So there is more interaction and more database interactivity happening behind the scene, which will use more resources. And communication will slow down a bit more. So that's why it's good to reevaluate the server and see if it needs an update, an upgrade, more resources. Okay, so yeah, the database size increased, which we discussed. It's good to check if the repository database is on local or separate node. More and more environments now, users are moving the repository to a separate node just because of this update. Because the repository is bigger, there is a need more to have a separate dedicated node for it compared to a long time ago where everything worked from central node. So this is something to keep in mind, especially if you have multi-node environment. The other common issue that we see here is the repository service when it attempts to talk to the repository database. Now, for the repository service to initialize, it waits for the database to initialize, and then it starts communicating with the database. So if the database size is getting bigger, when you stop and start the Qlik Sense services, the repository takes longer to run 100% and be ready for communication. So during this time, the repository service will attempt to talk to it, and it will not connect, or it will take longer. So you will experience things like hub is not accessible, and then you have to wait and either increase the communication timeout setting between the repository service and the database, or look at other alternatives like compacting the database. And this is why we have some database cleanup scripts that compacts the database. We have a table called entity log that can be compacted. Data can be deleted in there. Older versions of Qlik Sense had soft deletion, which means that it kept the data in the database and flagged them as deleted. So the database size was getting bigger and bigger. And in newer versions, we introduced hard deletion. And we have a script that goes and deletes and removes all these soft deleted data, and your database size gets smaller. So these are points to remember when you experience issues like this, that the repository could be causing all this because of the size and the interaction. We have lots of articles about cleanup and compacting and optimizing repository scripts that we can share with you. Another point, I'll try to be very quick here. It's to do with during the installation, if people have a backup of pre-installed repository, and then they went and upgraded the repository, and then something went wrong, and they try to restore an older backup, which is an older version of the repository Postgre backup. Of course, this will not work. So when you do a backup and restore, the version needs to match. So what happens then is people need to restore the environment back to older version and then restore the repository until it works, and then attempt the upgrade again, which adds a bit more work. It's just a point to keep in mind. We can't restore very old version of backup in the new version of Postgre, because each update, each Qlik Sense upgrade modifies the repository, adds, removes columns, renames columns, and so on, and then there will be a mismatch. Security rules, very, very common issue we come across. Security rules change from version to version, not change, but the way the security rules are evaluated are changed from version to version. Sorry, I just need to let one person into the meeting. Okay, it's good. So security rules, some environments have quite a large number of security rules, and sometimes we change the way security rules are evaluated. And when a user logs into the hub, it's good to remember that this user, once they log in, Qlik Sense will check all the security rules that apply, have been set for this user, to show them the areas that they need to see, the stream that they need to see, the app that they need to see, the options on the screen that they need to see. So we come across environments where security rules are quite complex and a few thousand and nested, and evaluating these security rules takes a lot of time. And because the code base is new, because processes are bigger in Qlik Sense, when we add the evaluation of security rules, things will really slow down and becomes very clear, very obvious. So it's good to check the security rules and optimize them if possible, or minimize them, or do a health check. Client-side JavaScript libraries, very, very important. Again, we use libraries, and these libraries are third-party, like Node.js, and they get updates based on security vulnerability, based on newer functionality, newer methods. And these libraries are bigger, so it means that the JavaScript that gets downloaded to the user browser when they open the hub and interact with applications takes longer, bigger size client-side coding that needs to be downloaded. They are called JS files. Same with CSS, which is style sheet, and they control the formatting, and HTML. So all this information and client-side code downloads into the browser and takes time. Once it's all downloaded, then the user can interact in the hub and do the selections and so on. And this is why it takes longer in newer version of Qlik Sense. So older browsers can come across problems. That's why it's good to look at the browser version as well and make sure the browser is up to date. Same thing with browser security settings. Some browsers block JavaScript or block certain parts of the JavaScript. It's good to check and make sure that the security is not too high and all the scripts are downloading to the user machine. We can, if you have any questions, we could discuss that area more. There are tools and things you can check and make sure that it's all downloading okay. Qlik Sense also has microservices now, and they're getting more and more added into the products. If you look at Service Dispatcher, if you Google Service Dispatcher Qlik Sense, you will see that it talks about Qlik Sense microservices. And microservices then has 12 or 13 different microservices there, like data prep and so on. And you can read about these, and these are all additional processes running behind the scenes, which also contributes to the fact that after the upgrade, you will notice resource need and slowness. On top of this, you could evaluate the load balancing rules that you have, the number of concurrent reloads, and the reload task times. Because if you add these along at the same time when people are using apps and developing or accessing apps, things will slow down. And finally, when you get information in the log saying that resources reaching high limits after upgrade, you will need to check and see if it's something specific for with an app or all apps. And we have tools there like the telemetry app or document analyzer, which is newer. And these show you at app level which visualization within the app is consuming how much resource. And then you can just ignore all the other objects, for example, and focus on that one object and see what expressions you have in there. Why is that one object slowing down the app? And obviously things change in Qlik Sense version, but you can focus and see, then you can isolate the expressions, and then you can contact support and say, okay, I've isolated this object, it has this expression, what changed in the product? And then we can have better information about that. So remember, yeah, the telemetry app and the document analyzer, there is a link, there are 2 links down there. Again, calculation variances based on expression evaluation. We have articles talking about this. Apps look differently. We all came across this. Colors are different, behavior is different. So this is why it's good to test on development. And if it's something blocking you from upgrading, let us know, and then we can check with our R&D team and see why it's been done and whether something can be done about it. Behavior difference, we discussed this. This has all been discussed, HTML, CSS. Data connections failing. The key point here is to remember that this is very, very important. When you upgrade Qlik Sense and certificates get upgraded, the Qlik Sense certificate store the key. This key is used for password encryption. So any passwords that you use this key to put encrypted value based on this key into the repository database. So if this encryption key change, the decryption of the passwords will start failing. And if the decryption of the password fails, your data connections will fail. So that's why we have an article that talks about after upgrade, you may need to, if certificates got impacted and changed, you will need to go into your data connections, re-enter the user ID and password for each data connections. Things like monitoring apps, all those will suddenly start failing. Just a point to remember related to upgrade. Custom changes, we discussed this. Custom configuration. And this final point is to use you all know we have a batch file that gets all the environment information. So if you experience differences, something that works in UAT and not production, or dev and UAT, you can generate this environment details, run the batch file on the server, one from the server that works, everything works, one that doesn't work, and then use a tool like examdiff, which is that last link on this slide. And the generated file from the batch file, it shows you the ports, the security group policies, it shows you what software is running, it shows you the nodes, it shows you a whole lot of information there. If you put them side by side in this examdiff file comparison tool, you could see what's different in the environment. And that did help us solve a few cases where we found out, okay, there is this policy there, there isn't, it's not on this server, and so on. So it's a point to remember that could help. Additional links here, again, to points that we discussed, the microservices, upgrade instructions, and that top one, it's missing the title. It's to do with getting the environment details, the batch file. And that's it from me. I hope this was useful. So thank you very much for joining.